So shared interpretations can be viewed as part of, so to say, the commons of democratic deliberation. We contribute to them by our own democratic choices, hermeneutic choices, sorry. And whether we like them or not, we are jointly influenced by them in our thinking, and they shape our practical attitudes. So that the contrast between interpreting things and changing the world, as in the excellent quotation on the thesis on Feuerbach from Karl Marx in Jonathan's lecture yesterday, should be taken cum grano salis in some respect. We are in fact influenced in our practical attitudes by our individual and collective interpretations of situations and challenges. And we put interpretations to use in a non-exclusive manner, of course. Usually, there is no check for mutual consistency, and the plurality of hermeneutic initiatives is considered welcome. It can bring about changes for the best, as it was recalled yesterday. At least it must be acknowledged that this plurality is part of a complex process of change in which an understandable correlation is to be found between ways of life, words, and the recognized meaning of rules and principles. But does it contribute to orderly and desirable change? So this is my question for this conference. Interpretations which convey claims of truthfulness play a major role in democratic deliberation. Presumably, they impact the fate of democracy in an age of deeply entrenched ideological divide. I'll give a few examples. Meanings and interpretations are part of our living up to a principled political life, and arguably we must examine their coexistence, which means also examining their mutual conflicts and reciprocal support. With this purpose in mind, I'll argue that we need an inclusive view of conflict as such. So as a confessed compromise theorist, I am in the opinion that very often we have a tendency, especially in political philosophy and ethics, to systematize conflict and to have in mind very clear-cut conflicts in which it is thy blood or mine, to borrow a celebrated phrase from economist Lionel Robbins. But very often conflict is just not like that. Sometimes we are in the world of Bourdieu and Laclau and Mouffe, but not always. And very often we are not in this kind of world. We have to deal with entrenched conflicts which are not easily recognizable. And I think it's quite useful to try and do some work in order to bring about some truths about complex kinds of conflicts, and especially conflicts which involve partly common interpretations. A preliminary question, of course, is are clarity and precision always to be preferred compared with the kind of ambiguity which is sometimes obvious in interpretations. And of course, the plurality of interpretations is itself a source of ambiguity, because sometimes we use the same words and the same sentences, and we sort of formulate the same principles with different thoughts behind, with different ways to understand the privileged examples. And so on. And so the plurality of interpretations is a source of ambiguity in words. It's a source of indetermination in the use of principles or norms. But is this always a source of confusion? Not everybody thinks like that. For example, Eduardo Gianetti da Fonseca states that sometimes clarity and precision may be bought at too high a cost, especially because the cost of rigidity in using technical terms to make things precise and to downplay the role of subjective interpretations can be costly. It can be damaging. For example, when we use the vocabulary of human rights, everybody knows that it's a domain in which there are many possible interpretations, but some way we like this kind of indeterminacy, and we are always reluctant to make human rights more precise, because I think that very often we want that our use of human rights can be open to moral discussion in a sufficiently open way. And so maybe we like ambiguity and indeterminacy to some degree, but of course not too much. And another important insight is that lack of clarity is not always an anomaly. It's not always a transitory phenomenon because it is involved in routines. It is involved in the way we are expected to use principles and norms. For example, this was nicely brought to light in an old book by James March and Johan Olsen about ambiguity and choice in organizations, in which the main examples came from university life. And ambiguity consistently impacts relative power and agentivity. It testifies to the limits of agreement, and it is fed by the plurality of interpretations. But do we have a clear mind about the kinds of disagreement which originate in interpretative versatility? And about reasoning about it in social life when it comes to implementing rules or norms or standards or principles? Plural meanings seem to introduce a degree of confusion into people's mind and into political debates. For example, a famous example is the notion of the market, especially as it is used in a country like France, where most people are reluctant about the market economy. The market appears alternately as a familiar institution, for example, the village marketplace, where you can trade your vegetables and so on. So this is familiar, this is reassuring, this is clearly connected to individual freedom, we like it, and so on. And it is also an occasion for social life. But there is another meaning of the market. The market can be an economic coordination mechanism based on prices, which amounts to a system for the allocation of resources that has its own operating logic and that requires a specific kind of regulation. I think this is the way most economic trained people would look at the market. Are used to that kind of understanding, and politicians too, and administrative officers are usually accustomed to this kind of understanding of the market. But there is a persisting ambiguity. For example, Raymond Barre, the former prime minister in France, had kind of systematized this ambiguity. He said, of course, the French don't like the European Union type market economics very much. This is quite alien to the way we commonly see the state and society and so on. But they can be made to understand something about the market if we use familiar examples. If we are concrete about describing selling and buying and so on, then the connection with freedom will be more obvious. But the next question is if you are not a politician, the next question is it the same thing? I'm not sure, really. There is a connection, obviously, but culturally speaking, it's not obviously the same thing. To take another example, sovereignty is now used both to designate economic self-sufficiency and to refer to political self-determination. Obviously, for a rank-and-file philosopher, it is not the same thing. We should protest against this mixing up of the two understandings. And in addition, it is invoked both at the national level and in the case of EU countries at the level of the whole Europe or the European Union. So in political life, we are kind of obliged to live with such superposition of interpretations. And this does not come to a clear-cut reduction or unification. People are like that. People use these words and principles in mutually inconsistent manners. So we can think of more complex examples in which playing with ambiguity, as we say in French, is a form of social and interinstitutional process that comprises discernible changes in the meanings of words. And these changes can affect the relationships between different normative criteria that are applicable to public policy. I'll give an example about state aids to private industrial or commercial activities in the EU with respect to Article 189 of the Treatise on the European Union, or the Rome Treatise, sorry. In other cases, the plurality of interpretations is linked to contrasting historical perspectives. For example, the invocation of civilization as a political campaign theme, as evidenced in the last weeks in France, unfortunately. It's a kind of, Huntington type of understanding of civilization. The use of civilization is often based on the assumption that Europe has a Christian foundation, which roughly coincides with the territory of the EU and a few culturally close states beyond the frontiers of the EU. It is also a campaign theme that serves to lend support to the idea of a collective defense against immigration movements. However, from an historical perspective, it's quite clear that Christianity itself is a story of migrations. And it can serve as an example of the impossibility to enclose a civilization within predetermined frontiers. And so a basic problem is the tendency to parochialize ethical benchmarks whose significance is intrinsically incompatible with arbitrary limits of space, lifestyle, or ethnicity, which are supposed to be able to be described in a univocal way. For example, if you consider the famous 70 or 72 disciples of Jesus Christ according to the Gospel of Luke, if we follow cherished ancient traditions which have accompanied European history, I compute that about, I'm not a specialist, I must confess, but I compute that about 25 among them left the Near or Middle East and chose to live in the territory of present-day European Union. And some of these early Christians are said to have left this territory and settled in Jerusalem or Palestine. Hermeneutic, so what do we say when we speak about Christianity or Christian Europe? What is it? It's not obvious. Probably historians have a very different view of it compared with some politicians. Hermeneutic variations can be problematic, and in an examination of democratic deliberation, we need to know what citizens and political party representatives are talking about in the first place. As the previous examples suggest, ambiguity reflects the plurality of perspectives, and it feeds the indeterminacy of principles or norms. Of course, this can encourage radical misunderstanding or mésentente, to use the phrase of Jacques Rancière in his famous book, in which he described in striking terms a situation which evidences the inability to make sense of the words and demands of others. What he called the primary quarrel about what agreement in language implies. It refers to moments of questionings of the presuppositions of discussion and their opacity for at least part of the population. Many people have noticed that these descriptions are quite interesting to question the use of technocratic descriptions as they are superimposed on familiar or day-to-day descriptions, which are not entirely left aside. This is the problem. If we were in a purely technocratic world, maybe we could design artificial societies and artificial economies, but this is not the point. The indeterminacy which surrounds basic principles may occasionally nurture frustration, popular frustration, in the face of democratic debate as it is, because it appears marred by a misguided reference to these principles. For example, in France, we have a principle of universal housing. And so when it comes to a right to housing, we are at the extremity of hard law. It is an individual subjective right which can be opposed to the state and so on. But nothing happens. Many people live on the streets and it goes worse and worse. So it's quite understandable that there is frustration before the ambiguity of words. What do we really mean when we say that there is a serious right to housing? We say this, but the concrete patterns in ordinary life do not reflect this kind of discourse. So I think this is connected with frustration about democracy. Democracy itself is an ambiguous term to some extent. The tendency to overload the meaning of the word can be explained by the desire to adorn other values with democratic prestige. But to the extent that there may be disagreement about which values should be given priority, ambiguity is then inevitable, and this is another obvious source of distrust. For example, associating democracy or so-called liberal democracy, I don't like this phrasing very much, associating democracy with individualism on the presupposition that increasing the capacity for individual initiative is always a good thing, presents an obvious risk for the defense of democracy, since not everyone shares an individualist worldview. In today's world, a common source of misunderstanding is the domain of economic matters and the companion relevant criteria of acceptability. There are problems with the frontiers of the economic domain and with the kind of normative statements which are relevant whenever an economic problematic is involved. The problem is that, according to some economists, there is really no frontier at all. For example, Hayek thought that economic ends have no real specificity. Everything is economic in the end. But if you look at everything through economic lenses, of course, your discourse will be equipped with the associated kind of normativity, and this opens the door to an economic treatment of all aids and their competition with one another. However, the form of economic normativity is not self-evident. Of course, it's always possible to describe the situation in economic terms. But it's not always obvious that from your own ability to do this, you can be confident about the way to associate the current challenges with a specific kind of normativity. And of course, standard economic normativity is not automatically legitimate. It is a form of normativity which is basically consequentialist. By and large, it relies on arbitration and compensation. It gives priority to the required adaptation to prices or to other signals that ensure mutual coordination. But are you always convinced that you should be silent and that you should just adjust to prices as they are part of reality? This is not obvious. It has a there is a kind of tension with the concerns about speech. And as the fields of studies about commodification show, we may wish to leave various areas of action outside this format of adaptation and agreement. And here, the popularity of economic discourse among political leaders is a potential obstacle. It's a problem. It might be the case that the meaning of efficiency or the common good, for example, is considered predetermined to some degree by economic standards. And this is a problem because there exist other descriptions of the same situations and practical challenges which tend to be associated with other understandings of efficiency or the common good or the public good. And this is a worrying kind of plurality of interpretations. Especially it's worrying for democratic debate because once again, how can we make sure that we talk about given objects and given practical issues? This can hurt practical deliberation. And plural meanings support alternative conceptions of the legitimacy of institutional actors in action or in the exercise of authority because, as it has been noticed by many writers, relative power depends on the meaning of words. And as dominant meanings evolve, they determine authority differentials that evolve in a correlated way. Sometimes it is even a matter of social engineering, for example, in the work of famous German economist Jürgen Backhaus about the constitutional value of property rights. And in his work, it's quite obvious that trying to make words used in a certain way, making full use of economics, philosophy, collective advocacy, and so on. This way to look at things is a good way to make sure that power remains on the side of owners as opposed to politicians. The process is not just the result of spontaneous changes in beliefs. Ambiguities also provide opportunities for ideological or doctrinal domination. And probably this poses a problem for the integrity of the political process, understood as a deliberative process leading to collective decisions. Indeed, it seems plausible to say that collective democratic decisions follow patterns of implementation that obey a definite structure. Grossly like this, free discursive exchange precedes moments of examination of the relevant decisions to be taken. Action then follows, and it should be possible to interpret it as an implementation of collectively reached outcomes of the discursive exchanges. The reasons that emerge in a moment of public deliberation must have a clear, or more or less clear, relationship to commonly recognized principles on the one hand, and with arguments concerning the pursuit of common good in relevant contexts on the other hand. Third, when decisions are taken collectively, they must be interpreted as a way of allowing some of these reasons, at least, to take precedence over others, over the other interesting reasons. Consequently, the actions taken must be interpreted in a continuous manner as ways of ensuring that these same reasons do prevail in practice. Such a sketchy deliberative structure provides resources for assessing the capacity for action and the actions themselves. And this can be used for change. The integrity of such a basic and familiar structure, however, seems fragile, especially in a number of complex situations. For example, in the case of what I have called with Annette Hadhazi, oblique politics. Situations where, when the reasons which are put forward are not directly correlated with the consequences of the action. So this is a strange at first sight, because normally we are expected to interpret political action as the result of commitment. Some people with legitimate power to act are committed to some principles, and then what they do should have expected results. Results which can be interpreted in terms of the preliminary commitment. So it should make sense. But does it always make sense? It's not clear. For example, we took the example of the strange interaction between the Danish bottle issue in Europe and success of the car gas emission Euro Parliament initiative. It took place in 1988. And this is an example in which the success of the initiative, which has long been a mystery for political scientists, how could the Euro Parliament, which has so little power, win such a case? How, in a cooperation procedure in which the Council and Commission seem to be incredibly more powerful, and they were against catalytic equipment for cars. Even though the Parliament proposed to do as the Americans and to put catalytic equipment on cars to reduce car gas emissions. And ultimately it was a success. But it was a mystery, and the explanation which seems to be robust is that it's been a success because of the interaction with another story, which had to do with the way the Danes recycled their bottles. So in Denmark, there was an interesting system for recycling bottles, a very pragmatic system. They still boast over it on the website of the Environmental Ministry in Denmark. And a very, very simple system. But at some point in history, the British suspected it to be some kind of anti-competition physical device, because it fitted Danish bottles better than the other bottles. Okay, so, and ultimately the British had it right, because the European Court of Justice ruled in the end that effectively, indeed, the Danish system was disproportionate and non-necessary infringement on the rules of competition in Europe, even though it had some interesting environmental advantages. But nevertheless, it was not well justified from the point of view of the principle of proportionality. But what happened in between? In between, at some point, because it was a very long battle with many actors, at some point it seemed that the Danes could be right, and so that it could be recognized that their initiative was good, and then probably there was an episode of panic, because if this could become true about water bottles, what about cars, for example? Would it be possible for the French to develop strange environmental standards to block German cars from entering France and competing with Renault and Citroën, for example? So there was probably an episode of panic, and so the explanation is that there has been an interaction between the two stories, and then we encounter in politics a phenomenon which is quite familiar for purely decentralized interactions, for example, in economics or in sociology. We are accustomed to look at phenomena which are the product of individual choices, but which are not associated with the intentions of actors. And this is a long familiar story, an 18th century story, of course, in the history of thought. But we don't like that in politics. In politics, we want that action can be interpreted and be reasonably interpreted in connection with commitments, intentions, projects. And of course, all the consequences of action cannot be anticipated. But at least the failures should be interpreted in terms of the preliminary commitments. And this does not happen here. And we had a number of other examples in mind because there is simply no connection. So you win from an environmental point of view, but you win for non-environmental reasons. So, and in the process, the Parliament's authority has become greater. The Commission's authority has been challenged. Another problem is when essential normative commitments are betrayed in the course of action, or when there is in the course of action a corruption of the essential institutional workings, or when there is an ideological takeover of the conduct of the action itself. And of course, when this kind of agency problem occurs, the course of the action is hijacked, so to say. For example, if you act in support of the industry or in support of popular areas, and then your action is interpreted in terms of economic orthodoxy. Is it true orthodoxy? Is it compatible with orthodox rules of economic management or good governance? Then there is a kind of ideological takeover because this was not your intention as a politician. When you acted, you wanted to produce some kind of change, but then the interpretation of the change you bring about becomes completely different. It is another kind of benchmark. In this case, it seems necessary to go beyond the observation of a simple change of course. The problem with the integrity of the process is not just a deviation from the path, which had been mapped out at the beginning, but also a change in what counts as a success in the relevant kind of action. So success becomes interpreted in a new way. Success and failure, of course. Here we are talking about a community that engages in a different political game from the one it was playing at the time of deliberation. Hence, there is a reorientation of the evaluative aspects which are taken into account in the management of collective action. So there is a problem with the implementation of principles or rules. For example, if there is a change in the criteria for what can be recognized as a reasonable response to the situation, or an acceptable way to lead a policy, and so on. Ideology and internal power relationships in political parties are two major factors here. They play a structural role in shaping democratic life. Let us consider a political community that is seriously committed when it deliberates, a community that knows how to commit itself collectively and that rejects deviations when it does not give its explicit consent to subsequent deviations from the collective commitment, for example, an initial and prestigious political platform. This community typically considers that its rules are to be enforced and that they have full legitimacy given their close connection to cherished principles. Under these conditions, it is no small thing to lose the possibility of collectively achieving the object or purpose of collective commitment because of changes in the rules of the interpretative game. When a new orthodoxy for interpretation of the results comes in. The sad news, I think, is that it might happen. Then it seems appropriate to diagnose a strong ascendancy of an ideological constraint whenever a certain arrangement of reasons proves capable of accounting for the change in the rules of the game that guide the conduct of the action, what I have called the rules of the interpretative game. In cases where such a loss of effective control materializes, the explanation of the reasons for the deviation, when it can be carried out with a certain degree of systematicity, can serve as the identification of an ideological takeover. Or if you like, it can serve as the identification of an ideology which associates doctrine and agentivity in action. So this would be my methodological proposal. And such a process can be related to approaches to alienation, which at the individual level emphasize the impossibility for the person to be what he or she ought to be, as explained, for example, by Axel Honneth in his lecture at the French Philosophical Society last week. But I think Axel is more prudent than I am concerning the ability of a collectivity to be seen as a collective agent with a ratified intention or a ratified commitment. So this is a parallel I suggest, but this is not necessarily the opinion of Axel Honneth. Decentralizing the use of norms and allowing the process to be markedly contextual is a possible avenue for decreasing conflict. Taking this side of things seriously, we should be committed to characterizing the kind of pluralism which can be allowed in the case of enforceable normative systems. Let's state that a normative system is a code or law subject to interpretation. It expresses, among other things, rules for behavior which are accepted as social norms. Then there is an ambiguity when there are several criteria or interpretations of the rules which can be used to assess the conformity of acts, events, or situations with respect to the normative system. Interpretations of rules suggest normative claims and initiatives which might, of course, appear problematic with respect to other possible and credible interpretations. So this is the fate of pluralism. The hypothesis I put forward is the following one. Free hermeneutic initiative is a source of scattered, sometimes indirect disagreement. So it's not only a matter of your opinion or mine, or your interpretation of the rules or mine, but more diffuse and somehow complex phenomena, like the following ones. For example, disagreement about the use of rules breeds shifting hermeneutic conventions. So again, we might take the example of the conflicts in Europe about state aids. Are they compatible with the free market and unbiased competition? Notwithstanding the massive ambiguities associated with the European treaties, such a political norm, the norm of that state aids should not destabilize competition, creating unfairness. This has had a general delegitimizing effect on state aids to industry and other kinds of state-driven economic intervention, including regional policy. It has also had a gradual delegitimizing effect on the initial interpretations of the exceptions. So the interesting technical issue is that there has been a shift in the nature of exceptions. Exceptions in the first interpretative steps had to do with not destabilizing fair competition to an excessive degree. And then there has been a shift to another understanding of exception, another way to look at legitimate exception, which has been more and more associated with looking at specific parts of economic activity. And so reaffirming the possibility that states claim dominion in which they are masters of what goes on, and so they can choose they can choose exceptions beforehand, and then they must be serious about not bringing unfairness in competition. Here, the interpretation of rules is a determinant of economic and political life. And at root, there are basic disagreements about the extent of state power, which is a truly political question. So it's a story like this. Initially, we can trace the government's conception of the legitimate potential domain of state action this way. European governments tended to think that there was some kind of delegation to European competence in some domains, but a larger domain was still a legitimate possible domain for action of the state. And the Commission has typically seen things another way. So concentrating on admissible action members for member states, which should be clearly defined. So this is a partly strategic, partly argumentative sort of political interaction. Dialogue is crucial, especially as it helps political actors describe problems and relate them to existing norms. Such a role in defining the subject matter of political interaction is hardly reducible to underlying interests. And discursive argument gets institutionalized in specific communication stages and procedures. This is a very complex universe of organized dialogue. The coordinating attempts by the government and the Commission heavily rely at each stage on the peculiarities of the situation, and this illustrates the importance of expertise to establish the details of controversial situations and to assess the results of past or ongoing policies. So in a way, each new situation creates a new interpretation problem. And the outcome of collective problem solving heavily influences the received interpretation of principles, rules, and their exceptions. So it is a two-way influence. Principles influence the way you solve concrete cases, and the way you solve concrete cases has an influence on the accepted or dominant interpretations of principles, rules, and the exceptions. But this is not a stable universe. It does evolve. It's a bit like stories about the shifting interpretations of the US Constitution. It does evolve over time, but not in a completely disorderly way. There's something to be understood about the way it does evolve over time. A notable feature of the process is that formal communication between institutions is cast into the mold of rule and exception rather than the balancing of interests or values. And this prepares the ground for a substantive role of argument. Okay. So we can try to trace various influences. I would say that the legitimacy position of the big actors in this kind of problem has an influence both on realized coordination opportunities and to the very nature of arguments. Because when you are an actor of a certain sort with legitimate domains for action, you can develop specific kinds of arguments, which would not be possible if you were some other kind of political actor. It's not like in philosophy or in a scientific congress in which we can put forward arguments irrespective of our own nature or situation. In this kind of dialogue, of course, it is very important. And realized coordination opportunities have an influence on credible arguments. If some arguments have proved useful to get out of a deadlock, then it becomes a prestigious kind of argument, and it will be reused. It will be used again, and with sometimes hardly predictable results. And the other way back, probably we should consider that arguments, of course, give opportunities to achieve coordination between political actors, and realized coordination opportunities have an influence on the respective legitimacy positions of the different actors, because usually it's not egalitarian. So something is achieved because an actor has accepted to make big concessions and to downplay initial commitments. And then the legitimacy positions, of course, are kind of reshuffled. And arguments themselves have an influence on the legitimacy positions of actors, because we live in a world of speech acts, and political discourse is part of politics. Politics is not just the world of pure behavior and action. Disagreement about the use of rules might lead to collective difficulties in the rationalization of choices. Arguably, we need a culture of disagreement, taking this complexity into account, in order to understand disagreement beyond face-to-face conflict, and in order to understand toleration or compromise beyond face-to-face accommodation, especially in contexts where decentralized, rule-based social mechanisms are favored. Political, institutional contexts in which we insist that several actors should have hermeneutic initiatives. They should try their best to make propositions in order to help us understand the principles and the rules and the benchmarks of different activities. But then we have to understand quite complex kinds of conflicts, which are not really reducible to pure deterrence relationships or rapport de force, and which are not reducible to the pure antagonism of economic interests. So in a collaboration with mathematician Davidson, Razafi, Mahatolotra, we had to make progress in this direction. We had proposed to equate an interpretation with the collection of disjoint sets of simultaneously chosen actions. So the set of rule-abiding actions and the set of actions which are not rule-abiding. It is often possible to delineate a family of rule-abiding actions which constitute a dominant interpretation of the valid rules at a given time. And a strong pluralist view can be formulated as follows. A normative system may be understood as a set of credible interpretations of rules. And then we might say that an interpretation consists of a collection of such sets. Then the plurality of interpretations is viewed as an internal characteristic of the very notion of a valid, enforceable normative system. It's not just an anomaly before we have a clear-cut interpretation of the normative system. And of course, in the work of legal theorists like Herbert Hart or Hans Kelsen, there have been important insights about the necessity to associate rules with a margin of interpretation. And this is very much in the same spirit. Absent an agreement on meanings, the interpretation of norms results in hardly predictable normative claims and arbitrary actions. So problems, possibly important problems, occur when interpretative tasks are parceled out to a plurality of agents who operate in various cognitive or perceptual contexts, when this diversity results in mutually inconsistent ways to implement rules. So I will give a final example. Consider an evaluative problem in which three states of affairs are to be compared, A, B, C, with situation A dominantly considered a more adequate implementation of the rules, of the relevant rules, than situation B. For example, consider a university situation in which various public universities should try to make associations between themselves under the guidance of a ministry and in a joint dialogue between themselves and with the public authorities of the state. And let us allow some degree of variation. Here it would be not really a subjective variation, but rather a collegiate variation. So you cannot do just anything. Sometimes what you could propose has no relevance at all. So we might say that, for example, A is objectively a better choice than B. But let us bring a degree of complexity with university people having their own collegiate views of the relevant kind of association. For example, should Nanterre University be associated with University College London, or with business school in Lyon, or with the University of Besançon? it's not always obvious. So there is a plurality of interpretations of what makes for the specificity of the university, or the specificity of philosophy or political science in the university, and so on. And so it seems quite inevitable that there is a degree of collegiate margin for interpretation. So we would, for example, consider a situation like this. It is a familiar structure from social choice theory. So in the eyes of X, A is better than B, which is objective, and B is better than C, which is not so objective. And in the eyes of Y, C is better than A, given their own collegiate conceptions, and A is objectively better than B. And then you have an inconsistent collective evaluation. If we, for example, if people in the ministry think that it is legitimate to give responsibility to university people, and that academics should have their word and should make the best choices for themselves and their institution. But at the same time, it's necessary to rely on objective facts. Some comparisons cannot be fanciful. Some comparisons, for example, between A and B, should be taken as objectively serious. But then the mix of collegiate interpretation and objective constraints on interpretation is not obvious at all. How do you do to put this in the same bag? It's not obvious at all. And here you see that it is the highway to inconsistency, to public inconsistency, because A is objectively better than B, and B is better than C in the eyes of Y, but then C is better than A in the eyes of Y, and Y has been presupposed to be competent for this problem. And so how do you do if you are a member of the nation, or if you are a politician or someone in the ministry? How do you do? It's impossible to. So there is a conflict which is not. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a complex conflict. It's a conflict about superposition of various constraints and aspirations about interpretations. In this situation, agents X and Y are not really engaged in an active disagreement. They are not even really engaged in a direct and active disagreement. But then the government will be unable to figure out a social view of the best choice to make in order to implement a rule of good academic, pursuing good academic cooperation. And it is also a problem for advice giving. Who will be able to give an advice in this kind of situation? Giving a piece of advice gives the indication that a certain way to implement the rule is chosen. For the collectivity, if this is an authorized implementation of the rule, this places a constraint on the kind of interpretation which can give guidelines for justifying the way people are treated in the light of the rule of the normative system. For example, if the political authorities consider that academics know it better about academic life. And the resulting constraints might prove inconsistent. They cannot be reconciled with consistent advice. So it is not a situation of war. It is not a war-like kind of conflict at all. But it's a problem in the head of a possible advisor. It's even difficult to think about a possible advice-giving person. In politics, of course, since the time of Plato, is very much associated with the thinking clearly about the possibility of advice giving. It's a kind of yardstick of classical political theory. And this in turn makes it pointless to look for an interpretation which simultaneously warrants consistent advice as to the implementation of rule and squares with the implementation or interpretation prerogatives given to specific agents. So, conclusion. A general framework has been discussed, and it has been argued that reliance on contextual implementation and interpretation makes it necessary to face problems which have to do with the conjunction of objective and subjective or collegiate or corporate normative assessments of states of affairs. Thus, it has been possible to try and characterize an indirect kind of conflict between decentralized hermeneutic processes, a conflict revealed by the fact that the implementation prerogatives, in some cases, cannot be supplemented by similar prerogatives for others and by objective benchmarks in a consistent way. In short, a tension surfaces up between given prerogatives for decentralized implementation and interpretation and providing justifications based on an interpretation of the rules. So I thank you for attention. Thank you.